Hi, I'm Megan Jamison.
I'm Leah Israel.
And I'm Christian Kuiper.
And today we are going to be discussing Dr. Dana Dunn's book, The Social Psychology of Disability, specifically Chapter 3, that deals with the challenges regarding stigma, stereotyping, and disability.
So I'm going to begin with an introduction. Dr. Dana Dunn starts with presenting two research articles and findings that are very interesting. So the first, a little bit more broad, found that and suggests that the presence of one trait in a person leads people to assume the presence of other traits. And the second finding, more specific to disability, finds that the presence of some disability, of which its nature was not revealed, led participants to make biased ratings in overly unfavorable or favorable directions. So this demonstration allows us to understand that context plays a huge role, and context guides people's impressions and intensifies their interpersonal reactions to the presence of a disability. This chapter continues to highlight and research on disabilities as a stigmatizing quality that elicits stereotypes and expectations regarding people with disability. Dr. Dana Dunn continues to define stigma as an attribute or identity that is perceived by other people to have broadly negative quality in a given context or culture. When people with disabilities are stigmatized by others, they serve as targets of primarily negative, deviant, worthy of devaluation, and or distancing by virtue of a particular characteristic. So continuously, she talks about the 6 dimensions of stigmatizing. The first can be visible versus concealable. So this presents the question of, is the stigma obvious, missing limb, or hidden, or is the stigma hidden, such as a mood disorder, psychological disorder? The second, what is the origin or responsibility for this condition? Is the stigma congenital, accidental, or self-inflicted? Third, aesthetic. Is the stigma distressing or upsetting to others? Fourth, perilous. Is the stigma viewed as dangerous or contagious to others? Fifth, disruptiveness. Will the stigma block or otherwise prevent social interactions or communication? And sixth, will the stigma change over time, getting better or worse? So the question that presents is which do you think persons with disabilities are most likely to be stigmatized? And the answer is number 1, visible versus concealable. So next, she talks about the 5 reasons that people rely on categories to prejudge people that they encounter. The roots of this emotional stigma stem from prejudice and people's tendency to prejudge those around them. So the first is that categories help people function in daily life. The second, that categories gather considerable information into idea clusters that helps because humans prefer to use as least effort as possible as they can to judge and decide. Third, that categories enable us to identify people and things. So this helps people know what groups of people are for, and stereotyping can guide our perceptions with speed and accuracy. Fourth, categories attach emotion. We have distinct feelings or like and dislike for people, objects, and ideas once they are categorized. And lastly, categories can be irrational. Categories enable people to readily develop and maintain emotional reactions to other people in social groups. It permits us to resist and ignore expectations and experiences. So these are a couple of the explanations that Alport gives for why people rely on categories to categorize people with disability.
All right, and these attitudes that Dr. Dunn brings up are largely based on the social encounter expectations that surround social interactions between PWDs and the outsiders. And these expectations are defined when outsiders harbor consistent expectations about what the experience of a disability must or should be like, despite the fact that the outsider's actual perspectives of having a disability defy those that outsider may have. And an example of this is seen through the requirement of mourning. And the requirement of mourning occurs when outsiders identify individuals as unfortunate, and because they have a disability or they are unfortunate, they must necessarily be suffering because of that instance. And if no suffering is on display, then the outsiders essentially devalue PWDs by thinking that they should be in English and asking themselves, why are they not in English? And for example, this can be seen in someone who has a facial disfigurement. So if someone has a facial disfigurement but they display pride, then that outsider would be very unsympathetic towards that specific individual. And then there are 3 types of required mourning instances. The first one is empathetic, which is largely based on outsider self-projection of suffering, and a sentence that could define this is, if I became disabled, I would be upset and distressed and never get over it. Therefore, anyone who is disabled must be consistently distressed and upset about having that disability. And when the suffering is not seen in this PWD, again, the outsider believes the PWD is just kind of masking that pain, and that they still believe that suffering is attached to a disability. The second one is the self-aggrandizing requirement, and this occurs when the outsider enhances their own self-importance when they compare themselves with the PWD. And when the PWD is not found to suffer, then that outsider essentially shifts their status and puts it up higher and puts themselves on a higher pedestal than the PWD does. And the third one is called the ought requirement of mourning, and this one is aligned with the sociocultural notions of what constitutes normal behavior towards PWEs. So outsiders will strongly insist that suffering is the correct response because that is how our society kind of portrays having a disability. And then in regards to meaning and suffering, so the search for meaning is supported by secondary gains, and those secondary gains can be defined as the positive side effects of disability. And the search for meaning essentially occurs when a PWD comes to the self-realization that they must deal with their disability, and they go on and search for the more positive side of their situation. But there are 2 things wrong with the meaning and suffering assumption. The first one being that putting PWDs on a pedestal based on their presumed search for meaning further enhances the social boundaries that exist between insiders and outsiders, and the second one being that meaning is not always linked to the traumatic events, such as having disability can be linked with other things. And then the just world beliefs stem from the just world hypothesis, which is that people expect that good things will happen to good people and bad events will occur to people of bad character. So outsiders will believe that successful people deserve their successes and less fortunate people somehow are responsible for their fate. And suffering is seen as being earned or observed based on the situation that a PWD puts themselves in. So for example, if you're in a car accident and you don't wear a seatbelt, outsiders would be very critical of you not wearing your seatbelt. Or if a child who has cancer, who's just diagnosed with cancer, who hasn't really done anything in the world, hasn't done much bad, that's also contradictory with the just world belief.
Okay, so an additional concept that exists within stereotyping is the halo effect. So that occurs when there is a single positive trait that someone perceives in another individual, and specifically here we're discussing PWDs. And when they perceive that initial trait, they then begin to attribute a lot of other positive traits to that person, whether or not they actually exist. So the issue with this is that PWDs can actually be off-put by those experiences, especially when they don't themselves believe that they are of a sainthood status, and that therefore limits the experiences that they have with interpersonal interactions. So can you go back? So, one quote that an actual PWD put up on a blog is that we're somehow above worldly creatures of the earth. Like we're not expected to be drinkers or smokers or even swear, and that just lets you know the experiences that exist for PWDs when they are put in this halo effect. An additional effect is the spread effect, and this is also similar to the halo effect. So when one negative experience is occurring, when someone perceives that PWD is having one negative attribute, that creates this ripple effect, and they assume that there are even greater negative attributes that go along with that person. For example, if someone had a stroke and an individual perceives them walking with a limp, they might also assume, oh, well, they must also have impaired memory and it's a speech impediment, and whether or not that is the case, that's what occurs. And therefore, their perceived severity of the issue increases against that person with a disability, whether or not that severity is actually there. And this spread effect is likely influencing the way that people treat PWDs. They are often treated as though they are infantile or they are needy and helpless, and that is definitely a negative experience for PWDs who don't actually perceive themselves to be any different than anyone else. So the fundamental negative bias is another component within stereotyping. So when negative bias occurs, this actually amplifies the negative characteristics that people recognize in this PWD. So 3 specific components of this are required for this fundamental negative bias to occur, and that is saliency, value, and context. And so the saliency occurs when an individual sees a PWD and they have maybe a wheelchair, or there's a speech impediment that's very obvious to them. That salience then exists, and that they place value on that, and outside observers believe that that's a negative trait, and then the context perhaps is not there, so the context is vague or not present, whereas people don't know what the person is actually like, then they are less inclined to believe that it's negative, and they see it as more negative than it actually is. So one example of a research study is that researchers found that when someone was just viewing the word blindness, they thought that was much more negative than when they saw the words blind people, because they had context and were able to attribute that blindness to a specific individual rather than just blindness in general. So context actually does affect the meaning of our words, which is important for us to recognize when we're dealing with persons with disabilities. And then finally, there is judgment that occurs outside of even stereotyping. And Fisk actually addressed this, and Dunn also took it up. But there is a warmness and a competence that we tend to judge people with. And when they have greater warmth, they're tended to be viewed as friendlier and more trustworthy. And when they are considered of having higher competence, they are more likely to be viewed as higher in status or more intellectual. And PWDs are consistently thought of as high in warmth but low in competence. So this leads outside observers to treat them with pity or sympathy. And because they tend to be placed in this category, there's actually a mixture of positive and negative associations that this outgroup places on them. So we actually tend to treat them with ambivalence or with different ways that we shouldn't be treating them. And so based on this information, it's really important for us to deal with stereotyping in general within our society, because PWDs are a big part of that. And so thank you for listening to our talk on Chapter 3 of Dr. Dunn's book.
Thank you.
Thank you.